I said, "Don't touch the Steinway." The piano teacher's voice cracked like a whip across the silent recital hall as Naomi froze, caught just inches from the keys she once called home. They thought she was just a janitor, a nobody. But when a crisis forced her to play, the room fell silent, and the world changed. This is the story of Naomi Walker, a gifted pianist buried by circumstance, silenced by class, and mocked by the very school that once could have celebrated her. What began as a cruel dismissal turned into a breathtaking revelation as Naomi stunned the conservatory with a performance so powerful it shattered egos and rebuilt an institution. But her story didn't end with applause. It sparked a movement that gave voice to every unheard artist. Now, before we dive deeper, please subscribe to our channel. We share powerful, meaningful stories like this every day. And drop a comment below to let us know where you're watching from. Thank you so much. And now let's get back to the story. Keep your filthy hands off the Steinway. The voice cracked like a whip across the marble-floored silence, sharp enough to pierce the sacred quiet of the conservatory's grand recital hall. Naomi froze, hands suspended above a single ivory key, cloth still folded neatly in her other palm. She hadn't even touched it. Not really. Just hovered. Hovered long enough to remember what it once felt like. The whisper of polished keys beneath her fingertips, the pull of music from deep within her ribcage like breath she'd been holding for years. Now the moment shattered like glass. At the far end of the room, Miss Celeste Raymond, the Academy's most feared piano instructor, stood framed in the doorway, arms folded, lips pursed into a disdainful line. Her stiletto heels tapped slowly against the floor as she advanced, each click echoing like a gavel. "Do you understand what this instrument is?" she sneered, eyes narrowing on Naomi's janitor uniform. "That piano is worth more than your yearly salary. I don't know what fantasy you're playing in your head, but if I ever catch you near it again, there will be consequences. Am I clear?" Naomi said nothing, just dipped her head. Not in submission, never that, but in something softer. Something quieter. "Yes, ma'am," she murmured, folding her cloth and stepping away, back into the shadows, where the overlooked always stood. Miss Raymond turned with a dismissive scoff, her long silk scarf fluttering behind her like a banner of war. In her mind, the moment was over. To her, Naomi was a nobody. But outside the cracked open window, spring wind stirred the curtains, and in the corner of the room where light dared to fall, a key whispered back into stillness. The St. Elora Conservatory of Music stood like a palace built for sound. Tall glass windows stretched into the sky, letting golden sunlight pour across red oak floors. The halls smelled of beeswax polish and old ambition. Every corner pulsed with pride, tradition, and something colder: hierarchy. Here, talent was currency. Family names opened doors, alumni sat on symphony boards, and cleaning staff, they were barely background noise. Naomi Walker had swept these floors for 5 years, always silent, always early, always careful. Each morning she arrived before the sun, her key unlocking doors before students filled the hallways. And each morning, before anyone else entered room 207, the main recital hall, she allowed herself 30 seconds. 30 seconds to walk past the Steinway. 30 seconds to breathe in the scent of mahogany and soundboard varnish. And sometimes, only sometimes, 30 seconds to hover. Just hover, her hand over the keys, and remember. Not that anyone ever asked. Not the teachers who looked through her. Not the students who left coffee cups on music stands. And certainly not Miss Raymond, who treated her like gum on the heel of a Louboutin. But Naomi didn't need them to ask. She had her own secrets. Secrets stored in the aching curve of her fingers, in the way she folded rags like sheet music. Secrets that whispered in silence like notes unsung. The confrontation in room 207 became legend by lunch. She was about to play it, apparently. A girl in a turtleneck whispered to a cluster of violin majors. No way. Did she think she was auditioning or something? Miss Raymond almost fired her right there. I heard she threatened to call security. Whispers floated down the halls like bad jazz, ugly and off-tempo. By dinner, someone had given Naomi a new nickname, Maestro Mop. The kids thought they were being clever. Naomi just kept working. She swept the practice studios, disinfected doorknobs, replaced the water cooler jugs. No one noticed the way her hands moved in rhythm, like she was still playing something they couldn't hear. A melody locked deep in her memory, something stormy, something unfinished. That night, after the final light flickered out in the dorm wing and the teachers had driven home to their hillside homes, Naomi walked back to room 207. She did this sometimes. When the silence felt like permission, the janitor's master key slid easily into the lock. She stepped inside, the door clicking softly behind her. There it was, the Steinway. Bathed in silver moonlight that poured through the high windows, the piano looked less like an instrument and more like a throne carved for gods. Naomi approached it, not with the boldness of entitlement, but with the reverence of an old friend. She didn't sit, not yet. Instead, she took a rag from her cart and polished the side panel gently, whispering under her breath. "It's still you, isn't it? You've still got that voice." Then, after glancing at the door, heart stuttering, she sat. Her fingers hovered once more. And this time, they fell. The first chord was soft, like an apology, but the second came sharper, stronger. Then the melody grew, flourished, spilled like water over the keys. The Liszt sonata flowed from her like blood from an open wound. Naomi played not like someone remembering, but like someone reclaiming. Each note she summoned sounded like defiance. Each crescendo was a scream no one ever let her make. And somewhere in the shadows of the hall, as the final note trembled into silence, a janitor became a pianist once more. But she didn't know that someone else had heard. Upstairs, behind the half-closed blinds of the teacher's lounge, a young violin instructor named Lena Halbrook stood frozen. She had forgotten her music binder and come back for it. She had no intention of eavesdropping, but the sound that drifted from the recital hall stopped her in her tracks. She peered through the slats, saw Naomi, saw the way she didn't just play the piano, she belonged to it. Lena covered her mouth with her hand, because what she heard wasn't janitorial fantasy. It was genius, and it terrified her. By sunrise, room 207 looked exactly the same. Steinway polished. Floors gleaming, Naomi already gone. Only the ghosts of music lingered, still humming quietly beneath the varnish. Ms. Raymond entered the room as she always did. Heels sharp, perfume stronger than necessary, and authority stitched into her every word. But for the first time, the silence of the room didn't feel obedient. It felt like it was watching. She glanced at the Steinway, then past it. Her eyes narrowed. Something felt different. And though she didn't know it yet, that morning marked the beginning of the end. Not for Naomi, but for everything Ms. Raymond thought was true about talent, worth, and who had the right to touch the keys. She touched it again. "I swear I saw her in there last night." Lena Halbrook's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried through the narrow office doorway like a knife. The janitor, Naomi, she was playing. Miss Celeste Raymond didn't even look up from her espresso. "Playing what? Musical mop handles?" she scoffed, flicking through sheet music like each page offended her. "If you're going to gossip, Lena, at least make it interesting. I'm not interested in urban legends." Lena stepped inside fully now, hesitant but insistent. "No, I'm serious. It was Liszt, the B minor sonata. I studied it at the conservatoire, and I swear, she didn't miss a note. She played it better than I've heard from most scholarship students." That got Celeste's attention. She raised an eyebrow, eyes narrowing. "You're telling me the cleaning lady, who can't even afford a haircut, played Liszt at 1 a.m. like she was Martha Argerich?" "I'm telling you," Lena replied, her voice trembling with something between awe and disbelief. "I stood there with my mouth open for 10 straight minutes. She's not just good, she's..." She paused. "She's dangerous." Down in the sub-level supply room, Naomi folded freshly laundered towels with mechanical precision. The hum of fluorescent lights overhead buzzed like static. Her back ached. Her fingers still tingled from the night before. She hadn't meant to play that long. But once her hands touched the keys, something ancient and beautiful broke open inside her, like a locket sealed for decades suddenly snapping free. And it hurt, not physically, but deeper. The kind of ache that comes when you touch something you've been grieving so long you forgot you missed it. At lunch, the whispers began again. This time, they weren't about mockery. They were about mystery. "I heard she used to be a concert pianist in Europe. Someone said she played for the president of France once. I heard she was blind and taught herself by ear, like Stevie Wonder. No, she was in a coma for 5 years and woke up playing Beethoven." By 2 p.m., Naomi had become a myth, the mop-wielding Mozart, the ghost in the recital hall. the woman who wasn't supposed to belong here. And yet, somehow, played like she owned the place. Back in room 207, Ms. Raymond sat alone at the Steinway, striking a few keys with a practiced hand. But something was off. She played the same lift passage, flawlessly of course, but it felt empty. Technically correct, but emotionally sterile. The way a robot might recite poetry. She hated the way the silence afterward felt heavier than the sound itself. For the first time in years, her mastery didn't comfort her. It mocked her. Later that evening, the dean of St. Alora's, Professor Emmanuel Grant, received an anonymous note in his mailbox. No signature, no explanation. Just 5 words, "Ask the janitor to play." At first he chuckled, thought it was a student prank. But something about the envelope, handwritten in perfect cursive, sealed with wax, made him pause. He carried the note with him all day, rubbing the corner between his fingers like a coin of fate. That night, Naomi returned again. She told herself she wouldn't play this time. Just a quick wipe down, a quiet goodnight to an old friend. But the bench was warm. The keys seemed to breathe beneath her hand. She played Chopin this time, soft, gentle, almost apologetic. The notes tiptoed through the hall like children sneaking past curfew. She didn't know anyone was listening. But 2 floors above, through a grated vent, the dean sat frozen in his office, tears quietly streaming down his face. He hadn't heard that piece played like that since his wife passed, and somehow this janitor, this ghost, had pulled her memory back into the room like sunlight through closed blinds. The next morning, Naomi found an envelope in her locker. Inside was a card. "Your talent deserves to be heard. Please meet me in room 207 at 5 p.m., Dean Grant." Her hands trembled as she read it again and again. She hadn't told anyone, hadn't invited anyone to hear her. But now, someone knew, and worse, someone cared. When 5 came, Naomi stood at the door of room 207, her fingers tightly clasped, nerves buzzing in her ears. She'd worn her cleanest shirt, tied her hair back, even dusted her shoes. She knocked softly. "Come in," said a warm voice from within. Dean Grant stood beside the Steinway, alone, sleeves rolled, no formality. He gestured gently. "Would you play for me?" Naomi blinked. "Sir, I'm the janitor." "You're a pianist," he replied, his tone unshakable. "And that bench is yours for as long as you want it." Naomi stared at him, throat tight. Something in her wanted to run, but something braver, something still alive, stepped forward. She sat, and once again the hall held its breath. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" The dean's voice was barely audible over the fading resonance of the last note. Naomi sat at the Steinway, hands resting gently on the keys, as if they were still humming beneath her fingers. She looked up slowly, her eyes soft but firm. Because no one asked. There was no resentment in her tone, just honesty. The kind that stripped a room bare. Dean Grant nodded, absorbing the weight of that answer. He folded his arms and leaned against the piano, his expression unreadable. "That piece," he said. "You didn't just play it, you spoke through it." Naomi gave a small, tired smile. "I used to, before life got louder." The next morning, whispers had turned to sparks. Sparks that were quickly becoming fire. Miss Raymond entered the staff lounge and found 3 of her students gathered around a tablet, watching a shaky, dimly lit video. One glance at the screen was all she needed. Naomi, seated at the Steinway, framed by golden moonlight, performing like someone born in another century. "Turn that off," she snapped, her voice cutting the air like a metronome gone wrong. They jumped. One of them tried to hide the tablet. But it was too late. Miss Raymond had already seen it, and worse, so had several others. The video had made it to the student message board. By noon, it had racked up hundreds of shares. By 3 p.m., someone had added slow-motion shots and dramatic captions, "When the janitor outplays the master." By 5 p.m., Ms. Raymond was in the dean's office, red-faced and shaking. "This is a disaster," she hissed. "She's a liability. She's unauthorized. She broke protocol." Dean Grant remained seated, calm and composed, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "She played," he replied simply, "and she played beautifully." "That's not the point," Celeste snapped. "This is a professional institution, a brand. You don't let the cleaning staff perform in recital halls like it's a bar on amateur night." "And yet," he said, raising an eyebrow, "not one person who heard her play seemed to think it amateur." The room fell silent. Meanwhile, Naomi was back in the supply closet, folding linens. It was as if nothing had changed, but everything had. She now walked the halls in a strange twilight zone, somewhere between reverence and curiosity. Some students smiled, others avoided her, uncertain. A few even nodded politely, but no one mocked her anymore. The name Maestro Mop had vanished like chalk in the rain. Later that evening, Lena Halbrook knocked gently on the supply room door. Naomi opened it, her hands dusty with chalk from classroom boards. "I hope I'm not intruding," Lena said, holding a slim leather folder in both hands. "I brought you something." Naomi blinked, then stepped aside, gesturing her in. Inside the folder were sheet music scores, clean, crisp copies of Beethoven, Rachmaninoff, and Satie. "I thought maybe," Lena continued, her voice gentle, "you'd want to practice again, with music meant for you." Naomi touched the corner of the paper as if it might burn her. Her voice was barely a whisper. "I don't know if I'm allowed to hope for that anymore." Lena smiled. "Then I'll hold the hope for you until you're ready." That night, Naomi returned to the piano with new eyes watching. This time, a small group had gathered. A few students, one faculty member, Lena, the dean. No announcement had been made, no invitation given, but word had spread. "She plays at 9:30 p.m. after the last lights go out." Naomi didn't mind. She didn't need a stage, just silence, and keys, and breath. She played Debussy's Clair de Lune, and the room seemed to exhale. It wasn't just performance, it was prayer. The next morning, a faded envelope arrived at Naomi's door. The return address read, New Orleans, L.A. Her hands trembled. She hadn't seen that handwriting in decades. Inside was a photograph, cracked with time. Her, age 19. Standing on the steps of the Tchaikovsky Conservatory in Moscow, hair wild, eyes bright, a music scholarship letter in hand. And behind the photo, a note. "Still the best I ever taught. If you ever come back to the stage, I'll be in the front row. Maestro P." Naomi sat down on her small cot and pressed the photo to her chest. The world she'd left behind had not forgotten her. Meanwhile, Dean Grant summoned a faculty meeting. The subject line was blunt: talent has no title. As the room filled with chatter, he stood at the head of the long mahogany table, waiting until silence took hold. Many of you have seen the video. Some of you have heard the music with your own ears. Naomi Walker is not simply a janitor. She's an artist, a scholar, and it is my belief that she deserves the same respect and opportunity as anyone else within these walls. A few murmurs. Miss Raymond stiffened. "This is absurd," she snapped. "She doesn't have credentials. She doesn't belong on our faculty. She studied at Tchaikovsky, toured with Maestro Petrov, was slated to perform at Carnegie before her mother's stroke forced her to return home." Dead silence. No one spoke. Even Celeste paled. "And she's still better than half the people in this room," the dean added softly. That evening, Naomi was handed a formal letter. It was printed on conservatory letterhead. "We invite you to be the closing performer at the Spring Honors Recital." She stared at the ink, unbelieving. "Me?" Dean Grant smiled. You're really letting her perform?" The voice was crisp, furious, and unmistakable. Miss Celeste Raymond stood in the center of the dean's office like a statue carved from cold marble. The recital program in her hand trembled with indignation. Naomi Walker's name circled in bold red ink. Dean Grant remained calm behind his desk, though the weight of her disapproval hung in the air like a thick curtain of smoke. "She's not just performing," he said coolly. "She's closing the recital, the final piece." Celeste's laugh was short and brittle. "You're handing our most prestigious platform to a janitor with a backstory straight out of a dime store novel. Do you understand how ridiculous this will look to the board, to the donors?" "I'm trusting the music to speak louder than the politics," the dean replied, folding his hands. "And if it doesn't," she snapped. He met her eyes. "Then I'll have made a mistake. But it won't be the first mistake made in this building, and it certainly won't be the cruelest." She turned sharply and left without another word. But in her eyes, there was something else now. Not fear, not anger, threat. That night, as Naomi rehearsed in the empty recital hall, she felt it, the growing weight of expectation. Students had begun slipping in to watch her, quietly, respectfully. Not like the snickering onlookers from before. These eyes held wonder now, curiosity, even reverence. But not everyone was rooting for her. From the hallway, Celeste Raymond stood in the shadows, arms folded, watching the movements of Naomi's fingers like a predator studying its prey. She couldn't deny it anymore. The woman could play, but she was never meant to shine. The morning of the spring honors recital dawned cool and bright. St. Alora's courtyard was filled with banners, floral arrangements, and conservatory alumni from across the country. For Naomi, it was surreal. She'd spent 5 years cleaning behind these very columns. Now she was walking between them with a performer's badge clipped to her blouse. Her name was printed in the program. Her seat was reserved in the green room, right next to scholarship winners and junior prodigies. "Miss Walker?" a timid voice asked. She turned. A girl no older than 20 stood holding a pair of pristine white gloves. I just wanted to say I've never heard Chopin like that. You made me want to practice again." Naomi smiled, heart swelling. "Then I'm already the lucky one." Backstage, the mood was electric. Students tuned instruments, teachers adjusted lighting, and guests settled into velvet chairs. Naomi stood alone, waiting for her moment. Until Celeste Raymond appeared beside her, holding a folder in one hand. "Quite the miracle story, isn't it?" she said with syrupy sarcasm. Naomi said nothing. Celeste held up the folder. "Thought you should know. I've changed the piece." Naomi blinked. "What?" "The board wants something more technical, less sentimental. We've replaced your chosen Debussy with Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3. Naomi's breath caught. That piece wasn't just hard, it was monstrous. It was the Everest of piano works. "I wasn't told." "It's in the program now," Celeste said sweetly. "You did say you studied at Tchaikovsky, didn't you? Surely this isn't beyond you." Naomi stared at the score. She hadn't practiced this piece in over 20 years. It was a setup, and Celeste knew it. "Or," Celeste added with a smirk, "you could step down gracefully, save yourself the embarrassment." Naomi looked past her, to the curtain, to the crowd beyond it. They were waiting, but more importantly, they were listening. "No," Naomi said softly. "I'll play." The lights dimmed. Applause filled the hall as the final introduction was made. "And now," the dean's voice boomed from the podium, "please welcome Ms. Naomi Walker, performing Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3 in D minor." There was a pause, then polite clapping. A few surprised murmurs, several heads turned. Naomi walked out slowly, no gown, no pearls, just a simple navy dress and a quiet strength that pulled the audience forward in their seats. She sat at the Steinway, the same one she had once been told never to touch. The page of sheet music lay before her, but her hands moved without it. She didn't need the notes, she remembered. The first few measures were cautious, like testing thin ice. But then, the tempo lifted. Her fingers flew not with brute strength, but with fluidity, precision, passion. The room fell completely silent. People didn't breathe. Not when her left hand crashed into a run of thundering chords. Not when her right danced across octaves with impossible grace. Not even when tears began sliding down cheeks in row 4, 5, 6. Celeste Raymond sat in the front row, frozen, staring, mouth slightly open. She had tried to humiliate Naomi. Instead, she had handed her the perfect stage. When Naomi struck the final chord, the room erupted. The ovation was instant, a tidal wave of hands and cheers and awe. People rose from their seats, students shouted, faculty members stared in disbelief. The dean stood, clapping, his eyes glassy. Naomi didn't bow. She stood slowly, quietly, and only when the roar had begun to fade did she step back, lay her fingers softly on the piano's frame, and whisper, "Thank you." Then she walked off stage as if the applause had never been the point. The applause still echoed through the conservatory's corridors long after Naomi had stepped off the stage. It clung to the high arches and coffered ceilings like the fading smoke of fireworks. And yet, as Naomi walked alone through the backstage hallway, it was not pride that weighed on her heart. It was the hush that followed. Miss Walker, a young girl, perhaps 16, came running, heels clacking across the marble. She reached Naomi breathless, eyes shimmering. "Can I shake your hand?" Naomi smiled, her fingers still tingling from the concerto. She offered her hand gently. The girl gripped it as if touching legend. "My father always said greatness wears suits, but I saw it in your hands tonight." Naomi squeezed her hand in return, then moved on, overwhelmed by the kindness, the energy, the quiet awe. But she also felt something darker stirring, something shifting behind the walls. Meanwhile, in the staff lounge, silence hung like a sword. Celeste Raymond stood stiffly, arms crossed, staring at the flat screen mounted above the espresso machine. It was looping Naomi's performance, now posted on the conservatory's official channel, already reaching thousands of views. Every strike of the keys mocked her. Every phrase of Rachmaninoff was a rebuke. Untrained, she muttered bitterly. Sloppy pedaling in the cadenza, no poise. No one replied, because no one agreed. Lena Halbrook finally broke the silence. She wasn't just performing, she was freeing that piano, like it had waited for her this whole time. Even Professor Myers, who hadn't given a compliment in 15 years, nodded. "I've taught here 3 decades, he said quietly, "and I've never seen anything like that." Celeste's lips curled into a tight smile, brittle as glass. It was theatrics. You all were dazzled by a sob story in a cleaning uniform. But the look on everyone's face told her the truth. They had stopped believing her. And worse, they had started believing in Naomi. The next morning, the Board of Trustees convened a private meeting. The topic, Naomi Walker. Dean Grant sat at the head of the table, calm as ever. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "you've seen the performance. You've read her background. What you haven't seen is what I've seen. Hallways of students whispering not with mockery, but with admiration. They don't see a janitor anymore. They see proof that talent doesn't come wrapped in privilege." One of the older trustees frowned. "She's not on staff. She's not credentialed." "Her resume was silenced by life," the dean replied. "She gave up her scholarship to care for her dying mother, and yet she still plays with more soul than our most decorated alumni." The younger trustee leaned forward. "Then why is she cleaning our floors?" The question settled in the room like a challenge and a shame. Outside the meeting, students gathered in the atrium. Word had spread like wildfire. A petition had already received hundreds of signatures. Make Naomi Walker a faculty artist in residence. Lena stood at the center, coordinating. "We're not asking for charity," she said into the camera of a local news outlet. "We're asking for justice, for recognition, for change." The reporter raised a brow. "Why now?" Lena didn't hesitate. "Because last night we saw something the school hasn't shown us in years. Humility, brilliance, humanity. We saw what music was meant to be." Celeste watched the news broadcast in her car, parked in the lot, hands clenched on the wheel. Everything she had built, her control over this institution, her reputation, her fear-based dominance, was unraveling. And it was unraveling at the hands of a woman with no title, no privilege, no power, only talent. And the world had finally seen it. Naomi, meanwhile, returned to work the next day in her uniform. She'd offered to postpone any decisions, any celebrations. "There are still halls to sweep," she'd said with a gentle smile. "Let's not forget the floors and the noise of the music." But when she arrived at the conservatory gates, the dean was waiting for her. In his hands, a folded blazer, navy blue, with the St. Elora crest embroidered in gold. "You won't need that uniform anymore," he said quietly, offering the jacket, "unless you plan to mop the stage between lectures." Naomi took it in her hands. The fabric was heavier than it looked, not because of weight, but because of what it represented. She looked up at him, eyes damp but steady. "Are you sure?" "The world's already heard your answer, Miss Walker. Now it's time we gave you the microphone." Inside the school, a new sign was being mounted on the recital hall door. "Studio 207, Artist in Residence Naomi Walker." The plaque on the door still felt surreal. Studio 207, Naomi Walker, Artist in Residence, not janitor, not guest, not other. Naomi stood before it in quiet reverence before unlocking the door for the first time with her new faculty key. The click echoed like punctuation in a sentence she'd waited a lifetime to complete. Inside, the room was just as she remembered it, but different. The piano gleamed beneath the morning sun, and a fresh bouquet of white tulips sat on the windowsill, a gift from the students. She ran her fingers gently across the lid of the Steinway. "Back again, old friend," she whispered. "Only this time, I'm not sneaking in." That afternoon, Studio 207 was filled with 30 students seated in a semicircle around the piano, notebooks ready, eyes wide. Some were classical prodigies, others were jazz majors. A few had transferred from other conservatories just to be part of her first master class. Naomi walked slowly to the piano wearing the navy blazer the dean had given her, sleeves rolled at the cuffs, collar open, no jewelry, no makeup, only presence. She rested her hands lightly on the keys but didn't play yet. "Tell me," she said, her voice even and calm, "why do you play?" Silence. Then a hand rose from the front row. A blonde-haired boy, tall, with the sculpted confidence of someone who had never been told no. "To perfect technique," he said. To win competitions. Naomi nodded slowly. That's honest. What else? Another student spoke. To express emotion. Good, she replied. Now play me that emotion. She turned to the boy in front, Carter Blythe, a senior student of Miss Raymond's, known for his technical fire and equally fiery arrogance. Mr. Blythe, I believe you know the Rachmaninoff etude in E-flat minor? Of course, he said, rising with a smug smile. I've won state-level medals performing it. Then please, Naomi said, stepping back, show us what winning sounds like. He sat and cracked his knuckles theatrically. His fingers flew across the keys, the tempo flawless, the dynamics loud and brilliant. His shoulders rose with pride as the final note thundered into silence. Applause followed, sparse but polite. Naomi said nothing at first, just returned to the piano and sat beside him. Now, she said gently, listen. She played the same piece, but it was a different language. She didn't attack the keys, she coaxed them. The notes came like breathing, sometimes gasping, sometimes whispering. The pauses between phrases weren't dead air, they were thought. By the time she finished, no one clapped. No one could, they were too stunned, even Carter. Naomi turned to him, not with smugness, but grace. Technique wins medals, but humanity moves hearts. The piano doesn't care who your teacher is. It doesn't care how expensive your suit is or how many trophies sit on your shelf. It only cares if you mean it. Carter looked away, face red, but not in anger, in awakening. Word of the lesson spread quickly. That afternoon, students flooded the digital message board. She feels the music. I've never felt that in a masterclass before. She made Carter listen, really listen. She teaches like she remembers pain. She doesn't teach us to play. She teaches us to speak. Meanwhile, in a nearby office, Ms. Raymond paced, alone. For years, Studio 207 had been her domain. She had shaped reputations there, controlled careers, built a silent empire of musical allegiance. Now it belonged to someone she used to order to mop the floors. She stared at her own piano, struck a chord, and winced. It sounded cold. For the first time in her career, she felt what Naomi must have felt every day for years, unseen. Unwanted, replaced. That evening, Naomi sat alone in Studio 207, long after her students had gone. She played a quiet improvisation, something new, unnamed. It wasn't classical, it wasn't jazz, it was hers. And somewhere in the far corners of the hall, faculty lingered in doorways, drawn by the sound, not just of music, but of truth. As she closed the lid for the night, she whispered to the piano, "It's not about being perfect, it's about being honest, and finally, I'm allowed to be both." The following week, Naomi's masterclasses were standing room only. Word had spread far beyond St. Elora. Local musicians, former students, even a columnist from the New York Times slipped into the back rows to watch the woman who had stunned the music world without a resume, without a pedigree, without permission. Every lesson felt like a revelation. Naomi didn't lecture, she invited. She didn't impose, she listened. When students played, she closed her eyes, not to judge but to feel. And when they stopped, she didn't correct their notes. She asked about their lives. "Why did your left hand sound scared today?" she'd ask gently. Or, "Was that anger I heard in your crescendo or grief?" It was unlike anything the Academy had ever seen. Students began practicing more, not out of fear, but out of joy. The energy of the conservatory shifted. You could feel it in the hallways, hear it in the music rooms, see it in the faces of young artists falling back in love with their craft. But not everyone welcomed the change. In the shadows of the faculty wing, Celeste Raymond plotted. Her control over the conservatory, once ironclad, was slipping. Invitations to guest judge competitions, gone. Her students, once loyal, were defecting to Naomi's masterclasses. She had tried to ignore it, then to dismiss it, then to undermine it. Now she intended to end it. She waited until the end of the week, when Naomi had just finished a late class and was returning to the faculty lounge to retrieve her coat. The lounge was dimly lit, near empty. On the table sat an open folder, confidential faculty review papers, grading sheets, and placement forms. Naomi blinked, unsure whether to touch them. She glanced around. No one. That's when Celeste stepped in. "Oh no," she said, voice sharp. "Are you reviewing faculty documents now?" Naomi froze. I was just looking for my coat." Celeste's tone turned theatrical. "That's interesting, because that file is protected under faculty confidentiality. You're not authorized to view it. In fact, that could be grounds for dismissal." A beat of silence passed between them. Naomi's throat tightened. She realized too late, the folder had been left there on purpose. Unless, Celeste continued, drawing closer, you'd like to explain to the board how the janitor turned savior of Studio 207 is now rifling through documents she shouldn't be anywhere near. Naomi stepped back. I didn't touch anything. But would they believe you? Celeste said, lips curling into a cruel smile. Or would they believe a tenured professor with 20 years at this institution? That smile faltered, however, when Dean Grant stepped through the doorway behind them. I would believe her, he said, voice like stone. Celeste turned, startled. Dean Grant, this isn't what it looks like. I know exactly what this is, he said. You've been trying to undermine Miss Walker since the moment she played a note. You set her up and you failed. He walked past her, picked up the folder, and closed it without looking. Thank you for your concern, he said flatly. You're dismissed. Celeste opened her mouth to argue, but the fight had left her. She turned and stormed out, heels snapping like gunshots across the tile. Naomi stood frozen, still unsure whether what had just happened was real. Dean Grant handed her the coat she'd been looking for. She's desperate, he said softly. When people see their kingdom crumbling, they lash out. But yours isn't built on fear, Naomi. It's built on truth. Naomi took the coat, hands trembling slightly. I didn't come here to start a war. I know, he said. You came here to teach. And that's exactly what you're doing. As he left, Naomi turned to the window, staring out at the conservatory courtyard, where students were practicing beneath lamp-lit arches. She watched a girl play violin while a boy accompanied on cello. She could tell they were improvising, fumbling, laughing, growing, and suddenly, she felt it. A wave of emotion that wasn't fear or doubt or even relief. It was belonging. For the first time in years, she wasn't surviving. She was living. But the battle wasn't over. Celeste wasn't finished. And the next move would be crueler than the last. 2 days passed in quiet tension. Naomi continued teaching as though nothing had happened, but beneath her calm exterior was a growing unease. Students still flocked to her sessions, and faculty who once ignored her now nodded in the halls, some even stopping to ask about interpretation, technique, phrasing. But the air had changed. Celeste was nowhere to be seen. Her absence was louder than her presence had ever been. Then came the email. It was sent to every student and faculty member at St. Elora. Subject line, a matter of integrity, an open letter. It was from Celeste Raymond. The body of the message was long, but its heart was sharp. A list of concerning irregularities in Naomi Walker's hiring, her lack of formal recertification, her unorthodox teaching practices, and a final paragraph questioning the wisdom of giving someone with no academic credentials such a prestigious position. She didn't name Naomi directly, but she didn't have to. The final line read, "Talent is not enough. Without structure, we risk turning art into chaos." By noon, the halls buzzed. Some students were furious, others confused. A few older faculty looked quietly uncomfortable. Naomi sat alone in Studio 207, the email open on her screen. She read it 3 times. Then she closed the laptop and stared at the piano. So this was how it would be. When music failed to make them listen, paperwork would be weaponized. She thought about replying, about defending herself point by point. But something inside her rebelled at the idea of justifying her life on someone else's terms. She didn't want to win an argument. She wanted to open a door. That afternoon, she held her regular masterclass. Students filled every chair. Naomi stood before them, composed but quiet. There was something new in her eyes, an intensity deeper than anger. "I've read the letter," she began. "You've probably read it too, and I know some of you are wondering if I belong here." No one spoke, but the silence leaned forward. "I don't have a degree on the wall. I don't have a list of publications or conferences. I don't belong to some elite circle, and for a long time, I thought that meant I didn't deserve to teach." She paused, fingers brushing the piano's lid. "But credentials can't measure pain, or discipline, or the nights I practiced until my fingers bled because I couldn't afford lessons, or the day I walked away from a European tour to care for the woman who raised me." Her voice never cracked. It sharpened. "You can question my background, you can question my resume, but don't question my love for this music. Don't question the hours I spent in the shadows when no one was listening. Don't question the fact that I play, because it's the only voice I ever truly had." A hush fell over the room. Then, one by one, hands began to rise. Not to challenge, but to stand with her. Students started speaking. One girl said Naomi was the reason she stopped doubting herself. A boy admitted he'd nearly dropped out before Naomi reminded him that failure wasn't a dead end. Even Carter Blythe, once Naomi's coldest critic, stood up and said quietly, "You taught me more in 1 hour than I learned in 4 years." Word of the masterclass spread faster than the letter. That evening, students organized a performance in the central courtyard. Dozens gathered, playing, singing, reading poetry, improvising. They called it the Unwritten Symphony, an ode to those whose talents lived outside official titles and academic praise. Naomi sat near the back, watching, invisible for the first time in a good way. Just part of the crowd, listening. Then the dean stood in front of the students and raised his hand. "I have something to announce," he said. Beside him stood 2 board members. "We have unanimously approved Naomi Walker's official appointment to the permanent faculty of St. Elora Conservatory. Effective immediately, she will also lead a new department, Expression and Performance, focused on emotional interpretation, improvisation, and non-traditional mastery." Cheers erupted. Naomi's eyes welled up. She hadn't asked for this. But somehow, the music had spoken loud enough. From the edge of the crowd, Celeste Raymond watched, arms folded, face unreadable. And for once, she didn't interrupt. She didn't storm out. Because the music, the very thing she had tried to control, had already rendered its verdict. Naomi was no longer the janitor. She was the voice they never knew they needed, and the one they could never silence again. The days that followed felt like a second spring, one Naomi never expected to live through. Every corridor she walked now greeted her with warmth. Students waved, called her Professor Walker with genuine affection, and not once did anyone mention her past with condescension. It had been transformed, no longer a source of shame, but a legend that carried weight, meaning, respect. But Naomi herself had not changed. She still arrived early, still sat at the piano alone before her first class, letting her fingers drift over keys without any particular intention, not to impress, not to prove, just to be. The difference was this: now, when she played, doors opened. Other professors began attending her sessions, not out of curiosity anymore, but humility. Some even asked her to review their syllabi or sit in on recitals. The walls between departments began to thin. Composers collaborated with improvisers. Classical students took jazz classes. Naomi's studio became a laboratory for emotion, for risk, for rediscovery. One morning, as she prepared for a student duet rehearsal, she found an envelope slipped under her door. No name, no address, just a simple note on ivory paper. "The night you played Debussy, I wept. Not because I lost, but because I finally heard what winning was supposed to sound like. I don't know if I'll ever match that, but I want to try. I'm sorry." It wasn't signed, but Naomi knew who had written it. And somehow, that mattered more than any applause. The seasons changed. Spring gave way to summer, and with it came the International Symposium, a week-long event where musicians from around the world would descend on St. Elora for workshops, concerts, and lectures. Naomi had been asked to deliver the keynote. She almost said no, not because she didn't feel worthy, but because she didn't know if she had anything new to say. But Lena, ever perceptive, told her something she never forgot. "You're not speaking for the ones in the spotlight. You're speaking for the ones still in the shadows." So Naomi took the stage that July evening, wearing a simple dress, no script, just a story. She told the room about a little girl in Louisiana who practiced piano on broken keys, about the night her Juilliard acceptance letter arrived, and the morning after when her mother's illness changed everything. She spoke of grief, of cleaning toilets while humming Chopin, of watching people walk past her like she was invisible. And then she smiled softly and said, "But music never stopped seeing me, and that was enough to keep going." When she finished, no one clapped at first. They simply stood, quiet, reverent, a standing ovation not born of spectacle, but reverence. That night, Naomi didn't return to her apartment. She walked back into Studio 207, sat at the Steinway, and played something she hadn't played in decades, her own composition. Something she'd written when she was 17. Something full of hope and raw fire. Something unfinished. She played it all the way through for the first time. And this time, when she reached the final measure, she didn't hold back. She struck the closing chord with both hands and let it ring into silence. She didn't cry. She just closed the lid, stood slowly and whispered to the empty room, "I'm home." Because she was. The letter came on a rainy Thursday morning. Naomi found it nestled between faculty mailers and program invitations, its envelope heavier than the others, the paper thick and embossed with gold trim. She recognized the seal immediately, the Tchaikovsky Conservatory of Music in Moscow. For a moment, her hands wouldn't open it. They just trembled there, holding history. Inside was a formal invitation, a guest residency, 4 weeks, a performance at their winter gala, a lecture on emotional expression in classical performance, and most striking of all, a request to lead a seminar titled The Unwritten Curriculum, Teaching from the Margins. Naomi set the letter down and stared out the window, where rain traced soft lines down the glass. She hadn't stepped onto an international stage in over 2 decades. The last time her name had been whispered in those halls, she was 19 and full of fire. She had been their prodigy, their star. And then, without warning, she had vanished. Now they were calling her back. Not out of nostalgia, but respect. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she taught her classes, just as she always did. She coached students through fear, helped them turn shaky notes into soaring phrases, listened to trembling voices that didn't yet believe in themselves. She told no one about the letter, not even Lena. But the question followed her like a quiet rhythm. "Are you ready to go back?" The conservatory continued to thrive. Naomi's department was drawing in new students from around the country. Articles had been written about her, some celebrating her journey, others cautiously dissecting the idea of a non-traditional rise. Still, none of that changed her. She remained grounded. Still arrived early, still played for herself in the mornings. Then, one night, a girl named Emiko stayed after class. She was Naomi's youngest student, only 15, and had struggled to find her voice at the academy. That night, she stood by the piano as the room emptied and whispered, "I don't think I belong here." Naomi tilted her head. Why? Because everyone talks about lineage, about technique, about how many hours they practiced in Paris. I don't have any of that. I just feel things. And sometimes I think that isn't enough. Naomi stepped beside her, rested a hand on the bench. "Do you feel them honestly?" "Yes." "Then it's more than enough." She sat beside Emiko and played a melody, not a famous one, not even a whole piece. Just a line she remembered from her mother's lullabies. Emiko listened, then quietly echoed it on the higher keys. They played together for 10 minutes, maybe less. But in that space, Naomi saw herself again. Not as she was now, but as she had been, young, unsure, burning with music no one asked to hear. That night, she went home and pulled the invitation letter from her drawer. She wrote her reply in ink. "Yes, with humility and joy I accept." The news spread fast. Students cheered. Lena hugged her so tightly she nearly cried. The dean raised a glass to her in the faculty lounge, his toast short but profound, to the voice we almost never heard but now, the world will. As the day of her departure drew near, Naomi walked the campus one last time, not as a janitor, not as a mystery, but as a teacher, a force, a living legend. At Studio 207, she paused at the door, ran her fingers along the plaque, and slipped a note beneath the piano lid. It read, "To whoever plays next, play like someone's listening, even if they're not yet." And then she walked out, suitcase in hand, raincoat draped over her arm, and disappeared into the morning fog with the same grace she had entered their lives. She wasn't leaving to escape. She was expanding the silence that had once held her back, and filling it, finally, with her music. Moscow in winter was everything she remembered. Sharp wind like needles on the face, skies the color of pewter, and music drifting like breath from old brick conservatories and chapel windows. The city had changed, but the ghosts hadn't. Naomi felt them the moment her boots touched the icy ground. They lingered in the stone arches, the frost-covered statues, and in the silent hallways where she had once rehearsed until her fingers bled. When she walked into the Tchaikovsky Conservatory, the air caught in her throat. The scent of old sheet music, rosin, and polished wood hit her like a memory too long buried. Every corridor held a younger version of herself, rushing to class, head bowed, hungry to impress. She was 19 again and 47 all at once. Her photo still hung in the corridor of prodigies, black and white, framed beside names that went on to grace stages in Vienna, Berlin, New York. She paused, staring into her own younger eyes, and whispered, "You made it. Not the way they expected, but you made it." The reception was understated at first. Administrators were polite, respectful, even warm. But there was hesitation behind the formality, a quiet skepticism still hanging in the air. Some remembered her. Most had only heard the story. The girl who vanished, the prodigy who disappeared into the working class, the musician who mopped floors in silence while her talent gathered dust. Until now. Her first performance was scheduled for the Winter Gala, an invitation-only concert held in the conservatory's largest hall. An ornate room with gold filigree, velvet drapes, and a chandelier that looked like a frozen explosion of stars. The seat assigned to her on stage was centered at a Bösendorfer Grand. She didn't rehearse in public. Instead, she visited the hall at night when the lights were low and the snow pressed softly against the tall windows. Alone, she practiced not perfection but presence. She didn't need to prove anything anymore. She only needed to tell the truth. The day of the performance arrived with snow falling thick and slow, blanketing the city like a prayer. Inside, the hall filled with alumni, critics, patrons, and students. Lena had flown in, sitting in the front row, eyes wide with pride. The dean from St. Elora sent flowers that sat in the lobby beside the event program bearing Naomi's name. She wore no gown, just a long black coat over a simple silk blouse, no jewels, no fanfare. When she stepped onto the stage, the murmuring crowd stilled, and when she sat, her hands resting quietly on her lap before touching the keys, the entire room seemed to lean in. She didn't start with Liszt or Rachmaninoff. She began with silence, and then a single note, low, gentle, then another. Her own composition, written in secret over decades and never performed publicly until now. It wasn't showy. It didn't demand awe. It invited it. The piece swelled slowly, rising like something born from grief and rebuilt with grace. It told of rain-soaked nights and dusty pianos, of rejection, of return, of beauty that did not beg for permission. When she struck the final note, there was no immediate applause, just stillness, tears on faces, hands frozen mid-clap. Then the wave came, applause like thunder cracking over snow. She bowed once, that was enough. She didn't need more. Backstage, a line of students waited to meet her. Not to praise, but to ask. How did she survive? How did she keep going when no one listened? What made her stay close to the music when the world pushed her away from it? She answered each question with the same quiet truth. I never stopped playing, even when I couldn't be heard, and that's what saved me. Later that week, she led the seminar they had named for her, the unwritten curriculum. The room was full, students, teachers, even administrators who had once dismissed the idea of her return. She spoke about how institutions forget the people who fall through the cracks, how brilliance doesn't always speak loudly, how some of the most profound musicians she'd ever known never made it to the stage. Not because they lacked talent, but because the world lacked imagination. They listened, and for the first time she felt the walls of that old place begin to shift. When the residency ended, they offered her a longer contract, a chair even. But Naomi declined. She returned to St. Elora, to Studio 207, to her students, her piano, her purpose. Because her story wasn't about climbing back to the top. It was about opening the door so others could walk through. She had been the silence once. Now she was the voice. The conservatory had changed, but Naomi didn't mistake attention for permanence. She knew how quickly institutions could forget, how applause could fade. So when she returned to St. Elora, she didn't bask in admiration. She got to work. The idea had come to her on the plane back from Moscow. A program, not a class, not a recital, a platform, a place for those who had been passed over, pushed aside, told in polite tones that they simply weren't ready. She would call it the unheard. She proposed it quietly, just a single-page outline she left on the dean's desk. By the end of the week, he called her in. You're not just asking for a recital series, he said, reading the proposal again. You're asking to rebuild the ladder. I'm asking to remove it, she replied, so no one needs to climb to be seen. The board hesitated. Funding was a question, logistics another. But the student body erupted in support. Testimonials poured in. Alumni signed petitions. Even former faculty reached out, some in guilt, others in admiration. The Unheard was approved by the end of the month. The first concert was scheduled for March, but not in the recital hall. Naomi chose the courtyard. Outdoors, open, no dress code, no invitations, just music and air and honesty. The performers included a cafeteria worker who sang opera in 5 languages, a maintenance man who'd once played cello in a touring symphony, a first-year student too anxious to audition but who wrote original jazz with aching soul. The crowd overflowed. Professors, students, journalists, city locals. Some came for curiosity, others stayed for catharsis. When the final performer stepped down, Naomi walked to the front. She hadn't planned to speak, but silence no longer felt like safety. It felt like waste. So she spoke. "This," she said softly, "isn't charity, it's justice. We're not showcasing exceptions, we're correcting expectations." That night, the video of her speech went viral. Again. But this time it wasn't about a janitor surprising the world. It was about a leader shifting it. 3 days later, she received a letter. No logo, no title, just a name scrawled across the back, Thomas Ellery. She hadn't read that name in over 20 years. Inside was a single photograph. A much younger Naomi, seated at a piano, laughing, not performing, laughing. Her arm around a tall, awkward man with thick glasses and a crooked smile. The note beneath it was short. "You told me I could be something once, and I wasn't brave enough to believe you, until now." There was a plane ticket inside, open return, a handwritten invitation to speak at a youth center in Chicago. She remembered now. Thomas had been one of the students in her Juilliard prep program. He'd vanished after 1 semester. No one knew why. She had. He didn't fit the mold. Quiet, unsure, broke, but kind and brilliant. She had told him he mattered. She hadn't known that voice had echoed for 2 decades. The next morning, she packed a bag. The Unheard would continue without her for a week. She'd trained others to lead, because Naomi's story had never been about staying still. It was about finding the voices that had been left behind, and reminding them, with music or without, that silence was never the end. Chicago greeted her with gray skies and wind that tugged at her coat like an old friend. The youth center sat in the middle of a quiet block, wedged between a laundromat and a boarded-up hardware store. Nothing about it looked grand. Nothing about it said, "Music lives here." But the moment she stepped through the doors, Naomi felt it. A cracked upright piano sat against the far wall, flanked by folding chairs and scuffed linoleum tiles. But what struck her most was the circle of teenagers gathered around a man whose back was turned to her. Tall, still slightly hunched, hair thinner now, but unmistakably him. Thomas. He was speaking softly, gesturing to a young girl at the keyboard. "Don't force it. Let it speak first, then answer." Naomi smiled. He hadn't heard her come in. When the girl played a few hesitant notes, Thomas nodded with quiet pride. "That's it. You're not imitating music. You're making it." Naomi waited until the phrase finished, then softly clapped. He turned. For a long moment, they just stared at each other. He looked like he wanted to say 1,000 things but couldn't choose the right one. So instead, he walked forward and pulled her into a quiet, warm hug. "You came," he whispered. "You asked," she answered. Later, they sat in his office, really just a closet with a desk and 2 chairs. Photos of kids lined the walls. Naomi noticed a worn printout taped near the desk, a quote in her handwriting from decades ago. "Music doesn't need permission to exist, neither do you." She touched it gently. "You kept this?" "It kept me," he said. They spoke for hours about the kids, the ones who didn't have instruments but sang like angels, the ones who couldn't read music but wrote symphonies in notebooks, the ones no one believed in until someone finally stayed long enough to listen. Naomi didn't make any speeches that night. She didn't sit at the piano or give a lecture. She just listened, watched, encouraged. At the end of the visit, a quiet boy in a hoodie approached her, eyes down. "Are you the piano lady from the internet?" She chuckled. "That's one way to put it." "I play too," he mumbled, "but not like good." She kneeled so they were eye to eye. "You don't have to be good yet," she said. "You just have to be honest. Play me something honest." He did. 3 notes, all wrong but real. She smiled wider than she had in weeks. When she boarded the plane back to St. Elora, her heart felt both full and open. Because this was what she'd always known. Applause fades, headlines vanish, but impact stays. She returned to Studio 207, to her piano, to the students who needed her. But she wasn't the same. She had gone from silence to sound, from invisible to unforgettable. And now, she was no longer just a teacher or a story, or even a symbol. She was a bridge, for every unheard voice still waiting for its chance to be seen. Months passed. Spring arrived again at St. Elora, slow and quiet, unfolding in soft pink blossoms along the academy's old stone walls. Naomi walked the campus daily, not as a figurehead or celebrity, but as something much rarer, a constant, a presence that no longer surprised but anchored. The Unheard program had grown. What began as a single courtyard performance was now a formal initiative with chapters in 4 cities. Schools reached out weekly. Community centers asked for guidance. Students who'd once been afraid to raise their hands now volunteered to lead sessions, saying things Naomi once only dared to think. You don't have to prove you're worthy of sound. You are sound. One afternoon, as Naomi was leaving a composition class, a woman waited by the gate. Gray streaks in her hair. A familiar sharpness in her eyes dulled by time. Celeste Raymond. Naomi stopped. Celeste didn't smile. She didn't sneer either. She just held out a manila envelope. I resigned last week, she said flatly. It's time. I stayed too long. Watched too much pass me by. I have things I need to learn now, and unlearn. Naomi took the envelope cautiously. Inside were annotated lesson plans. Dozens, each one marked, revised, and footnoted. At the top of the first page, written in red, what would this sound like if the student were me? Celeste looked tired, but also lighter. I used to teach to protect my place, she admitted. You teach to remove the walls. I don't know if I can do what you do, but I'd like to try, wherever I end up next. Naomi simply nodded. They weren't friends. They might never be. But something passed between them in that moment. Neither apology nor forgiveness, but truth. And that was enough. Later that evening, Naomi returned to Studio 207. The room was empty, warm with the amber light of sunset. Her piano waited patiently. As she sat, she noticed a note tucked under the lid. Professor Walker, I found this melody in a dream. Can you help me finish it? It was unsigned, scribbled in pencil. The notes were shaky, raw, incomplete, but it was real. She placed it gently on the stand, studied the rhythm, then rested her fingers on the keys. The first few chords were hers. The rest would belong to someone else. Because that was her purpose now, not to dazzle or defend, but to keep the song going long after her own hand stopped playing. She closed her eyes, breathed, then began to play. She was told to clean the piano, not touch it. Laughed at, dismissed, forgotten. But when Naomi Walker finally played, the very institution that silenced her had no choice but to listen. From janitor to professor, from whispers to standing ovations, she didn't rise through the system. She rewrote it. Because talent doesn't need permission. It only needs a moment to be heard.